The noise of the intersection filled the air. Car horns, bicycle bells ringing, scraps of conversation. Winter was making itself felt. There was a sharp chill in the air, and the asphalt glistened from the recent rain. People hurried about their business without even noticing each other. But, in the midst of the chaos, a figure stood out. A black woman in a wheelchair, carefully rolling over the zebra at the crosswalk. She looked vulnerable, but there was determination in her gaze. Her hands strained to push the wheels, her face contorted with pain. The pregnancy made every movement difficult. But she moved forward against all odds. Cars stopped, giving way, and it seemed there was more to this moment than just obeying the rules. But, in a split second, everything changed. A motorcyclist suddenly burst out of the side stream. His engine roared loudly, and without slowing down, he flew into the crosswalk as if there was no one in front of him. Black leather jacket, dark helmet, his appearance was sharp and aggressive, as were his actions. The woman saw him at the last moment. Her eyes went wide, but there was no time to dodge. The motorcyclist whistled, signaling, but didn't slow down. And then it happened. The front wheel of the motorcycle hit the wheelchair with a thud. The woman screamed as her hands slipped off the rims and the wheelchair jerked violently to the side, its wheels sliding on the wet asphalt. The woman barely held on, but the forward tilt caused her to sink heavily downward, as if gravity had decided to subjugate her. The motorcyclist turned around for a moment, but didn't stop. His hand nervously adjusted the throttle handle, and he continued as if nothing had happened. The people around him stopped. Shock, silence. And then the noise started. Someone shouted. Someone pulled out their phones to film what was happening. The woman, with shaking hands, tried to return the wheelchair to an upright position. Her face was wet with tears and rain, but she kept silent, clenching her teeth. It was a struggle for dignity that was being fought in front of a soulless crowd. But this moment did not go unnoticed. In the far corner of the intersection, like a shadow from another reality, a tall man appeared. His silhouette against the glare of the cars was strong and confident. He walked at a leisurely pace, but his every step was imbued with tension. It was Dwayne Johnson, and his gaze, fixed on the motorcyclist, blazed with rage. The motorcyclist didn't drive away. He stopped a couple of meters farther away, turning the bike sharply. His engine roared like an angry beast as he turned to face a woman struggling to lift her wheelchair. Her arms were shaking, her legs were helplessly pinned to the chair, and her eyes darted from passerby to aggressor as if looking for rescue. A goddamn traffic jam because of people like you. The motorcyclist's voice cut through the air. It sounded muffled in his helmet, but no less angry. You don't belong here. You belong in a hospital room somewhere. The woman raised her head, her face expressing both fear and pain, but there was something more in her eyes. She wanted to answer, but the air around her seemed too heavy to find words. The crowd, watching the scene, remained at a distance. No one moved, no one helped. Someone pulled out a phone, but not to intervene, only to take pictures. The motorcyclist was silent for a second, looking at the woman as if assessing her weakness. His hand squeezed the throttle, and the bike howled menacingly. You're all the same here, he threw, his voice louder, his words filled with venom. Do you think anyone owes you anything? Look at you, you're just causing trouble. With these words, he sped forward, aiming the motorcycle straight at the woman. She tried to dodge, her hands clutching the wheelchair, but the motorcyclist made a sharp turn. His front wheel struck the side of the wheelchair with such force that it flipped over. The woman's belongings scattered on the pavement. Her bag, a few baby things she was probably preparing for her future child. All of it fell into puddles, covered in mud as the woman collapsed on the sidewalk. Her scream pierced the street, making people involuntarily wince. It was a scream of pain and humiliation, a scream that none of the eyewitnesses had forgotten. "You deserve it," the biker said, leaning forward slowly so he could hear her. His words sounded like a poisonous drop dripping on a naked wound. "Don't let normal people get in the way of your life." Her gaze met his eyes behind the dark visor of his helmet. Her breathing was heavy, the pain in her back from the impact of the wheelchair worse, but she tried to rise again. Her hands trembled, her clothes soaked with dirt and moisture, but her face expressed no fear. She didn't answer. Her silence became her resistance, but that didn't stop the aggressor. He stepped off the bike, removing his helmet. Beneath it was a face full of contempt and malice, as if he was enjoying every second of his domination. He stepped closer, leaning over her. "You hear me, you worthless thing? You're worthless. There should be fewer people like you." His voice was quiet, but every word hit harder than a punch. At that moment, someone in the crowd shouted, "Enough! Leave her alone!" But the motorcyclist didn't even turn around. He had already raised his foot to hit the overturned wheelchair that lay in the puddle. At that moment, there was absolute silence, as if the whole city was holding its breath. And then came the sound of heavy footsteps. They drowned out even the noise of the engine. The motorcyclist froze, turning around slowly, and met a gaze that sent a chill down his spine. Dwayne Johnson stood behind him. His broad shoulders obscured the light of the headlights, his face like a stone monument to rage. His eyes stared straight at the biker, unwavering. Johnson's silhouette was monolithic, like a wall that knew no barriers. "Hey," Dwayne said, his voice low and quiet, but every word was creepy. "You have 1 second to crawl out of here while you're still in one piece." The motorcyclist froze. Something that looked like fear flashed across his face, but he was still trying to maintain his superiority. "And who are you to tell me what to do?" he snapped, trying to make his voice firm. "The one who stops you," Johnson replied, stepping forward. "Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Have you had similar incidents in your life that have left a strong mark? Subscribe so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now we continue. The silence on the busy street was almost palpable, as if the world had stopped breathing for a second. People stood along the sidewalk, watching, but no one moved. No one stepped forward to help the woman lying next to the overturned wheelchair. No one stopped the motorcyclist who seemed to enjoy his power. A whisper ran through the crowd. "It's terrible," said one woman, holding onto her companion's arm. "He just hit her like that," echoed another voice, but the whispers changed to something else. "It was probably her own fault," said someone behind her. "Why crawl out into the road like that?" These words hung in the air, causing a murmur of disapproval, but no one dared to reply. The whole situation seemed to highlight not only the rudeness of the motorcyclist, but also the prejudice of those around him. "What the hell is the world coming to?" muttered a man in an expensive coat, watching a woman trying in vain to lift an overturned wheelchair. "I'd help, but I don't want to get involved." "Need a hand?" snorted someone nearby. "What's the point? They'll always complain anyway." Someone was filming what was happening on their phone, taking close-ups of the woman's face covered in mud and tears. Someone, pointing at her, weakly whispered that such situations were her fault. One man, holding his camera up to a motorcyclist, wryly threw in, "Look, that biker just wanted to pass. Maybe she did it on purpose. To make a scene later?" Every word from the crowd was drenched in prejudice, heightening the tension. The woman looked up, her breathing heavy. She saw people looking at her, some with pity, some with contempt. They were the same looks she had faced all her life, as if her existence was a challenge in itself, as if she had to constantly prove her right to be here. "She's black, and she's in a wheelchair." "What did you expect?" whispered one woman to her friend, who nodded with a strained smile. Someone in the crowd did raise their voice. "Hey, that's no good. Somebody help her," shouted a young girl, but instead of approaching, she just stayed where she was. Her words were lost in the general inertia. At that moment, the crowd's attention shifted. Dwayne Johnson, who seemed to have grown out of thin air, stood next to the motorcyclist, his gaze focused, his voice low and full of menace. He reminded everyone that silence was no longer an option. "Is everyone just standing there?" he said, looking out into the crowd. His voice broke through their apathy, causing people to look away from their phones and conversations. "Is this how you react to injustice? Are you filming this as a show?" The crowd froze. Some looked away in embarrassment. Some stopped filming, but no one stepped forward. Johnson's words were an accusation, and everyone standing there felt it. "She's a woman, she's in a wheelchair, and she's suffering because of his actions," he continued, nodding toward the motorcyclist. "And you just stand there and watch." But despite his words, silence filled the space again. People continued to stand as if their own fears and prejudices had made them immobile. The motorcyclist grinned, looking at the crowd. "See? They all know their place. Nobody's going to interfere, because nobody wants to." The words sounded like a challenge to not only Johnson, but to everyone around him. But, unlike the others, Dwayne wasn't going to stand aside. He stepped forward, and the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The only sounds at the intersection were the roar of the motorcycle engine and the whispering of the crowd, as if it were a chorus of indifference and fear. And she lay in the dirt, a black, pregnant woman in a wheelchair. A look of pain and humiliation froze on her face. Her fingers trembled, clutching the wet asphalt, but she still tried to reach for her upturned wheelchair, as if striving to prove that she could stand up, that she could not be broken. The crowd, as if mesmerized, did not move. They looked at what was happening like a scene from a cheap drama, where the main thing was not to help, but to get a good shot. Some continued to hold their phones, and some even smirked, discussing what had happened. "She's one of those people who's always looking for pity," whispered a man with an expensive watch standing off to the side. "Just watch. She's going to start sobbing." "She's already humiliated herself," the woman next to him added. "Look at her, lying there like she deserves it all." The words came to her. The woman clenched her teeth and tried to get up, pulling the overturned wheelchair toward her. The pain in her back and stomach was unbearable, but she knew that if she stayed on the ground, it would be another victory for all those who looked down on her. But her strength was leaving her. She made one more movement, but her body weakened and she collapsed back onto the pavement. And then there was the sound of footsteps. Slow, steady, sharp. The footsteps were not hurried, but each one seemed like the sound of thunder. People began to turn around, making way. In the crowd, someone whispered, "Is that Dwayne Johnson?" No, it can't be. He's not here, is he? But as the man's figure approached, there was no doubt. He walked, taking his time, but his face was a mask of determination. Dwayne approached the woman, slowly crouching down to meet her gaze. There was no pity in his eyes, only sympathy and determination to help. His hands gently lifted her up, and then, almost gently, he lifted the overturned wheelchair. Setting it steady, he helped the woman sit up. She looked up at him, her lips trembling, but she didn't say a word. Her silence was louder than a scream because it was the pain of a lifetime. Johnson nodded as if to say, "You can do this." But his face changed as he turned to the motorcyclist. Anger boiled up in him like a volcano ready to erupt. The intersection was quiet again, but it was the harbinger of a storm. The motorcyclist, who until then had been looking at the crowd with a smirk, now tensed. His self-confidence seemed less as he met Johnson's gaze. "Do you think this is normal?" Dwayne said quietly, his voice as cold as steel. "Who the hell are you to tell me what to do?" The motorcyclist snapped, trying to make his voice firm, but fear was already evident in his movements. He tried to take a step back, even though his bike remained on. "I'm the one who stops people like you," Johnson replied. His voice didn't get any louder, but every word sounded like it was hitting the motorcyclist's chest. The motorcyclist laughed, but there was nervousness in that laugh. "It's her own fault," he said, pointing at the woman, "crawling across the road, getting in the way. There's plenty of them around here. They think they can do anything just because they're, you know." These words, soaked with contempt and racism, caused Johnson to feel something more than anger. He took a slow step forward. "Say that again," he said, looking the motorcyclist straight in the eye. "You heard me," he continued, though his voice shook. "She's nobody. They're all nobody." Johnson approached, his figure obscuring the motorcyclist from the light of the headlights, and now it seemed that the man was standing in front of the giant. There was absolute silence in the crowd, as if everyone was afraid to move. "Hear me carefully," Johnson said. "Her life is worth more than your pathetic bike, your words, and everything you have to offer this world." The motorcyclist swallowed nervously, but still tried to look confident. He gripped the handlebars, preparing to ride away, but Johnson stepped closer and put his hand on his shoulder. The gesture was quiet, but the motorcyclist shuddered as if a mountain had fallen on him. "You're not going anywhere," Dwayne said, his voice like a sentence. The motorcyclist froze for a moment as Dwayne Johnson's hand rested on his shoulder. That simple gesture was like a slab of concrete that instantly pinned him in place. He slowly turned his head, and his eyes met Johnson's impenetrable gaze. The crowd around him held its breath, as if everyone expected something unimaginable was about to happen. "I said, you're not going anywhere," Dwayne repeated, his voice low, even, but with a strength that could break any will. The motorcyclist let out a short laugh, though there was a flicker of nervousness in his eyes. He adjusted his helmet as if trying to gain confidence and leaned his shoulder back to drop Johnson's arm. "Who are you to tell me what to do?" he snapped, his voice louder than he probably meant it to be. "You think if you're a star, you can shake it in the street? It's none of your business." The crowd buzzed, people whispered, and some started shouting. "He's right. Get him, Dwayne. This guy has already gone too far." But the motorcyclist ignored them. His attention was fixed only on Johnson. He frowned and, trying to look confident, added, "I was just passing. It's her own fault. People like her are always getting in the way. She thinks she's allowed to do anything just because she's, There's too many of them." The words were so loud that the woman in the wheelchair, who was still being comforted by the young couple, raised her head. Her eyes reflected a mixture of pain and fatigue, but she was silent. Her silence shouted louder than words. "You have no idea what you just said," Dwayne said quietly. His face was still, but every muscle in his body was tense as a taut string. "You don't even realize how pathetic you are." The motorcyclist grinned, though his hands shook nervously. He gripped the bike's handlebars and pretended he was about to step on the gas. "You think you can scare me? I've seen hundreds like you. You all think you're better than everyone else because you have money, fame, power. But the truth is, you're hypocrites like the rest of them." The crowd began to revitalize, people craning their necks to get a better view of what was happening. There was fear in the eyes of many, but hope in the eyes of some. Someone shouted, "Shut up already, you're wrong." The motorcyclist ignored this and continued, his voice getting louder and louder. "This woman, she's nobody. She was lying there like garbage. And you want to protect her? For what? She's not worth your time. She's the kind of person who's always asking for help, who never does anything on her own." Dwayne slowly leaned closer, their faces a few inches apart. His eyes burned with icy fury. He didn't shout, his voice remained low and threatening, but in that calmness was a power that could break anyone. "Are you calling her a nobody?" he asked, each word sounding like a blow. "You call a woman who fights for her life every day a nobody? You, who hit defenseless people to make yourself feel powerful, you call someone a nobody?" The motorcyclist opened his mouth to reply, but Dwayne continued without letting him get a word in. "You think your words mean anything? They're nothing. You are nothing. Your actions show only one thing. You're weak. Weaker than anyone you've ever attacked." The crowd froze. Now, even those who had been filming what was happening put down their phones. Johnson's words cut like a knife, and everyone felt the force. The motorcyclist, on the other hand, twitched nervously. He grabbed the handlebars of the bike and tried to pull away, but Dwayne stepped forward, grabbing him by the collar of his jacket. In one motion, he forced him off the bike as if he weighed no more than a child. "Do you want to leave?" Johnson asked. "Do you want to avoid the consequences? Is that how you think it works?" The motorcyclist tried to mutter something, but his voice shook. Now he was really afraid. Dwayne let go of his jacket, but his gaze remained hard, as if he could see right through the man. "You're going to stand in front of her," Johnson said, nodding toward the woman in the wheelchair. "You're going to apologize, or I'll make sure you never get on your bike again." The motorcyclist slowly turned his head toward the woman. She was sitting in a wheelchair, her gaze heavy, but there was a shadow of hope in it. The man opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. He looked at Johnson, then back at her. "Yeah," he began, but his voice trailed off. The motorcyclist swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the woman in the wheelchair, the crowd, and the towering figure of Dwayne Johnson. He felt the air around him grow dense, almost pressurized. The crowd was now looking at him with judgment, and the woman in the wheelchair, sitting in the dirt, seemed like a mute testament to his insignificance. It infuriated him. Everything inside him was screaming, "You can't lose like this." Suddenly, as if driven by a flash of rage and humiliation, the motorcyclist grabbed his helmet. His face contorted into a vicious grimace, and he lunged forward. In his hand was the helmet with which he intended to strike Johnson. It was a desperate gesture, unreasonable, reckless, but filled with hatred. You think you're in charge here? You think you can tell me what to do?" he shouted, raising his helmet like a weapon. "You're just like her. You think the world revolves around you because you're special? It's all a lie." The crowd gasped as he rushed forward, but Johnson didn't move. His face remained cold and focused, as if he had already anticipated the aggressor's every move. When the motorcyclist was close enough, Dwayne made only one movement. His hand swept forward, and he intercepted his opponent's wrist as easily as if it were a child's toy. For a moment, everything stopped. The motorcyclist froze, realizing that his attack had failed, and Johnson held him with unyielding strength. Dwayne leaned forward slightly, his gaze icy. "Did you think hitting me was a good idea?" he said quietly, but there was such power in his voice that the biker jerked involuntarily. "Power is not aggression. Strength is defense of those who can't defend themselves, and you have no idea what that means." Before the motorcyclist could respond, Johnson, without letting go of his wrist, twisted his arm easily, causing his attacker to drop his helmet. The helmet clattered to the ground, but all eyes were on Johnson and the motorcyclist. Dwayne spun him around so that he was on his knees, and with a strong but careful motion, he immobilized him. It didn't look violent. It was professional, almost machine-like a man accustomed to acting quickly and efficiently. The motorcyclist tried to break free, but his attempts looked pathetic. Johnson held him lightly, as if he weighed nothing. The battle was over before it had even really begun. The crowd around burst into applause. The people who had been standing on the sidelines before began to shout words of approval. "Way to go, Dwayne. That's what justice means. A man like him, that's a lesson for life." The motorcyclist looked at Johnson with bated breath. There was no longer aggression in his eyes. Now it was fear. He realized he'd lost, not just physically, but mentally. Johnson let go of his hand and he collapsed to the ground, leaning helplessly on his palms. His face was red with humiliation, and he avoided looking toward the crowd. Dwayne slowly straightened up, looked at the crowd, and then turned to the woman in the wheelchair. He walked toward her, his face softening as he spoke. "It's okay. He won't hurt you anymore." The woman looked up with difficulty. Her eyes glistened with tears, but now they were tears of relief. She tried to say something, but her voice shook. Instead, she only nodded, clutching her shaking hands. Johnson looked back at the biker, who was still sitting on the ground. His voice was firm and commanding again. "Apologize. Now." The motorcyclist looked up, his lips trembling. He mumbled something, but Johnson leaned closer, making him feel again the same icy rage that had paralyzed him earlier. "Louder, so she can hear." "I'm sorry." The motorcyclist squeezed out, his voice full of hatred but also helpless. "I didn't mean to. I'm sorry." "It's not enough," Johnson said. "You will remember this day, because I'm going to make sure you never dare to even think about hurting anyone ever again. You understand me?" The motorcyclist nodded silently. His spirit was broken, and his face expressed only self-pity. The crowd continued to applaud. Some even began to shout out their thanks to Johnson. But Dwayne wasn't smiling. His eyes remained focused. He knew he had done the right thing, but his heart was still seething with anger at the injustice he had witnessed. Before we continue, let's take one more short pause. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from, and if there have been similar incidents in your life that have left a deep mark. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now we continue. The crowd gradually dispersed, but there was still tension in the air. mixed with quiet admiration and bewilderment. The woman in the wheelchair sat motionless. Her gaze was directed somewhere in the void, as if everything that had just happened was just another page in her book of pain and humiliation. Johnson stood beside her, his figure still suggestive of safety, but he knew that this struggle had not begun for her today and might never end. This woman, Julianne, was born in a neighborhood where her skin color had always been like a stigma. She was used to the stares, to the whispers behind her back, to the word "they" sounding like a sentence. Even as a child, she felt that her dreams weighed less than the fears of those around her. Her mother often said, "You have to be stronger. If you break, they will win." Those words became her mantra, but the strength her mother spoke of came at too high a price for Juliana. When she was 20, her world collapsed overnight. She was coming home after a long shift at the restaurant where she worked as a waitress to pay for college. The streets were quiet, but silence always carried a threat. This time, the threat materialized in the form of two men. White, dressed in cheap leather and smelling of cheap alcohol, they surrounded her like a pack of predators. Their words were full of venom. "What are you doing here? Do you think you have a right to be here? Go back to where you came from." She tried to leave, but they blocked the way. Julianne struggled. She screamed, tried to break free, but no one heard her. These two men weren't just attacking her, they were determined to destroy her. They beat her as if they wanted to erase her existence. One of them hit so hard that she fell to the ground, and then everything went black. When she woke up, the pain was unbearable, and her legs wouldn't listen anymore. The medical report sounded like a verdict. Spinal cord damage. She would never walk again. The doctors said she should be grateful to be alive. But how can you be grateful for a life in which you face contempt every day? When people see you in a wheelchair and turn away because they don't want to look into the eyes of someone else's pain? When they think your misfortune is your fault. But Julianne didn't break. She refused to disappear like those who attacked her wanted. She learned to get around in a wheelchair and then found a way to get herself back into life. Her pregnancy was an unexpected gift. A man who once looked at her without pity but with love gave her hope. But even that couldn't erase what she faced every day. Her every trip through the city was filled with difficulties. Buses often passed by, pretending not to see her. People in stores would wrinkle their nose when she blocked the aisle. And sometimes someone would bluntly say, "Why do you even leave the house? You're better off sitting where you're not bothering anyone." But she kept going. Every day she proved that her life mattered. Today was no exception. When she saw the motorcyclist coming straight at her, her first thought was not for herself, but for her child. She already knew she was going to be hit. She knew this could be the end. But she fought on again. Even as her wheelchair overturned and she collapsed to the ground, her mind screamed only one thing: "I will not give up." Now, sitting in her wheelchair, she looked at Johnson. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but understanding. That understanding meant more to her than all the support she had ever received. He knew this wasn't just a random incident. It was part of the system, part of a society where people like her always ended up at the bottom. "You're strong," he said, quietly but firmly. "You're stronger than most of us." Those words hit something deep inside her. She looked away to hide her tears. She didn't want anyone to see her weakness, but this time she realized they weren't tears of weakness. They were the tears of a survivor. The noise of the intersection slowly returned, but now it was not the familiar city hum. but a mixture of voices, emotions, and contradictions that overwhelmed all those who had witnessed what had happened. The crowd was no longer silent. People who had just been filming what was happening on their phones or watching from afar began to speak, each in their own way. Their words were like a reflection of what was hidden in the depths of their own hearts. Some applauded. Their hands clapped loudly, not hesitating to express their admiration for the way Dwayne Johnson dealt with the motorcyclist. "Wow!" shouted one man. "Finally, somebody put that bastard in his place." "Serves him right," added a woman in a business suit. "People like that only understand power." "Johnson, you're our hero," shouted a young boy, recording the whole thing on his phone. But not everyone in the crowd shared that sentiment. In the background, someone muttered, "A hero? He's just taken advantage of his fame. If someone else had done it, he would have been arrested by now." "What are you talking about?" one of his neighbors objected. "Did you see what that motorcyclist did? Did you hear what he said? It was disgusting." "Disgusting?" The man turned to the arguing man with a smirk. "It's her own fault. Climbing into the street in a wheelchair. Couldn't she have waited until the road was empty? It's always the same. They think their weakness makes them special." Those words ignited the fire. The young girl standing next to him clenched her fists and stepped forward. "Weakness? Did you seriously say that? You think being in a wheelchair is a choice? Is skin color a choice too?" "I think that's their problem, not mine," the man replied dryly, shrugging his shoulders. "Why does everyone have to pretend that their lives are more important than the lives of normal people?" The crowd began to buzz like a swarm of angry bees. "Who are you to judge us?" the man in the leather jacket retorted. "You were standing there filming too." "Because you were all standing there," she shouted. "One man did what each of us should have done, and you're just making excuses for yourselves." The words jumbled together in a noise like the beating of a drum. Meanwhile, the motorcyclist was still sitting on the ground, breathing heavily and avoiding his gaze. His face was red with shame, but the fire of hatred still smoldered in his eyes. He glanced at the crowd and, gathering his courage, shouted, "You're all crazy. I'm the victim. He attacked me. He's using his power to threaten me. Is this your justice? It's just lawlessness." These words caused a new explosion in the crowd. Some began shouting, accusing the motorcyclist of racism, while others defended him, saying Johnson had crossed the line. Conversations got tougher. "They always use racism as an excuse," shouted someone from the crowd. "If he wasn't black, no one would pay attention." "Did you seriously just say that?" snapped at the girl. "Did you just justify assaulting a pregnant woman in a wheelchair?" "This is not an attack," the man screamed. "It was just an accident." And why did she think she had the right to block the road anyway? These words cut through the air like a knife. The woman in the wheelchair, who had been silent all this time, finally raised her head. Her gaze was fixed on the speaker. Her voice was quiet, but her every phrase was louder than any scream. "My right to be here is the same as yours. My life matters. But you'll never understand that, because you've never lived knowing that your every move is met with hate or pity from others. You've never heard yourself called a nobody just because of the way you look or because you're in a wheelchair. You don't know what it's like to fight every day not only for life, but for the right to just be." The crowd fell silent again. Those words struck it like a bolt of lightning. Some looked away, some frowned, some nodded in agreement, but the tension still hung in the air. It was a moment of truth when everyone present saw their own reflection in what was happening. It was at this moment that Dwayne Johnson stepped forward. His voice was low but filled with power. "It's not just about her," he said, pointing to a woman in a wheelchair. "It's about all of us. Each of us makes a choice to look away or to fight. If you choose to look away, you're already on the side of injustice." Those words toppled the last barrier. People began to look at each other differently. Some lowered their heads, feeling guilty. Others tried to meet Johnson's gaze, to feel a little of his power. But it was clear to everyone. This wasn't just a scene on the street. This was a challenge. The siren of a police car cut through the air like a knife, forcing the crowd to part. The arrival of the police only fueled the tension that already hung in the air. People whispered, looked around. Some started recording the video again, now focusing on the incoming officers. The situation became even more unsettling. In the eyes of many, there was an expectation that justice would finally prevail. But in some, there was fear. Justice often chose the side of force, and it was not about protecting the weak. Two officers got out of the car, looking around. One of them, a middle-aged man with a bushy mustache, immediately noticed the motorcyclist, who was still sitting on the ground, breathing heavily and furtively wiping his face. The second, a young woman with a stern look and a stern expression, looked around the crowd. Her gaze lingered for a moment on a woman in a wheelchair, dirty, wet, and clearly tired from everything that had happened. But no one knew what she would think. The motorcyclist saw the policeman and immediately jumped to his feet, as if he had found a new confidence. His voice got louder, his movements sharper. He clearly wanted to regain control of the situation. "Officers!" he shouted, pointing at Johnson. "That man attacked me. It was him. I was just trying to get through, and he decided to make a circus out of it. He scared me, he threatened me, and then he pushed me." The officers looked at each other. The man with the mustache moved closer to the motorcyclist, gesturing for him to calm down. "Let's take it from the top," he said calmly, but there was a tiredness in his voice. "What exactly happened?" The motorcyclist began to speak quickly, his words flowing. "I was riding along, not interfering with anyone. Then this woman," he waved his hand in the direction of a pregnant woman in a wheelchair without even looking at her, "drove right into the road. I barely had time to stop, but she fell. I had nothing to do with it. And then this guy," he pointed at Johnson, "came at me. He started threatening me, pushing me, inciting the crowd. That's not true. I didn't do anything wrong." The crowd became noisy. Some shouted that the motorcyclist was lying. Others shouted that the police should check the records. Officers tried to calm people down, but the chaos was already beginning. A young female police officer approached Jones, who had stood silent the entire time, watching the motorcyclist squirm in his excuses. "Sir, can you explain what happened here?" she asked firmly, but without aggression. Johnson nodded, his face cold, but his eyes determined. He raised his hand, pointing to the woman in the wheelchair. "It all started when this man," he said, nodding toward the motorcyclist, "deliberately hit her wheelchair as she was crossing the road. He saw her. He could have stopped, but he sped up and hit her, causing her to fall, and then he started abusing her." "That's a lie!" the motorcyclist shouted out, but the officer with the mustache raised his hand, silencing him. "Carry on, sir," he said to Johnson. "I went over to help her," Johnson continued. "As I lifted her up and put the wheelchair back on, he continued to say disgusting things. They were racist comments, derogatory. He claimed she was a nobody and that it was her own fault. And when I told him to stop, He tried to attack me with a helmet. "It's not true," the motorcyclist shouted again, but now his voice trembled. He realized that his words were losing weight against Johnson's confident and calm narrative. The policeman listened attentively. The young woman looked at the crowd. "Can anyone confirm these words?" she asked, addressing the crowd. Hands went up. People began to speak at once, interrupting each other. "I saw it. He's right. That motorcyclist was just insulting her. I have it all on video. I can show you." The police asked for video, and several people came forward with their phones. The evidence began to come together like pieces of a mosaic, painting a picture that was far from favorable to the motorcyclist. "That's not fair," he suddenly shouted as he saw the police looking at the tapes. "They're all against me, just because I'm not afraid to tell the truth. You're all victimizing her because she's black. What about me? Who's going to protect me?" These words caused a wave of outrage in the crowd. People started shouting, calling him a racist and demanding that he be arrested. The police had to raise their voices to calm the crowd. "Enough," the officer with the mustache said firmly, addressing the motorcyclist. "We've seen enough. Your story doesn't hold up. We will take you in for further investigation." "It's because of him," the motorcyclist pointed at Johnson again. "It's a personal vendetta. He just decided to destroy me because I told the truth." But the motorcyclist's words didn't matter anymore. The crowd began to applaud as the police handcuffed him. Johnson stood next to the woman in the wheelchair, his face still calm, but his eyes wide with fatigue. It was a fight he had won, but he was not happy about it. As the motorcyclist was led away, a young policewoman approached Johnson. "Thank you for your help," she said. "You did a great job." "It wasn't me," he replied, looking at the woman in the wheelchair. "She was the one who made a big deal out of it. She stayed strong when the world tried to break her." The ambulance stopped on the sidewalk with a loud howl. The medics jumped out of the car, their movements quick and precise, but not without caution. The woman in the wheelchair, who had held back her pain for so long, was now beginning to lose strength. Her face was pale and her lips trembled, but her gaze remained steadfast. She looked at those around her as if trying to memorize everyone who had witnessed her humiliation and her struggle. Dwayne Johnson was still standing beside her, his massive figure seeming to be the only thing protecting her from the world around her. As the medics gently helped her onto the stretcher, he leaned over and said quietly, "You're stronger than you think. You're going to be okay." She didn't answer. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of weakness. They were the tears of a survivor who, despite everything, kept fighting. The medics lifted the stretcher into the car, the doors slammed shut, and the ambulance slowly drove away, leaving behind a silence that seemed deafening. The crowd was silent. People stood there as if not knowing what to do next. No one seemed to want to leave because everyone felt they were part of something bigger. This was not just a clash in the street, not just a conflict between two people. It was a moment that turned their own fears, prejudices, and indifference inside out. Dwayne took a step forward. He turned to the crowd, his gaze running over the faces. There were those who applauded, those who were silent, and even those who were still trying to make excuses for the motorcyclist. But he spoke for everyone. "You all saw what happened," he began. His voice was low but deep, like the sound of thunder. "Each of you witnessed the injustice. Each of you made a choice to help or to stand by." He paused to let the words reach everyone. "You saw a person in a wheelchair, a pregnant woman being hit, humiliated, insulted. And what did you do? Many of you did nothing. You stood by and watched as if it were just another video to be taken down and forgotten. The crowd stirred. Some looked away. Some lowered their heads. It's not about her, he continued, pointing in the direction the ambulance had gone. It's about all of us. It's about how we let these things happen, the way we turn a blind eye to racism and prejudice and cruelty, the way we think it's not our problem until it's too late. His words cut like a knife. People froze because they knew he was telling the truth. This was not a scene from a movie. This was their reality. This woman showed more courage today than many of us will ever find in ourselves, he said. But she didn't have to fight alone. No one should. If you see injustice, you have an obligation to act, not wait, not take pictures on your phone, not make excuses. Act. Because if you don't, you become part of it. The crowd was silent. Even those who had argued before were now at a loss for words. Johnson's words were not loud, but they hit the heart of the matter. One of the young men, who had been standing aside all this time, slowly raised his hand. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have done something. We all should have." "This is just the beginning," Johnson replied. His voice had softened, but it was still strong. "Each of us can make a difference. Today, tomorrow, every day." The next day, the whole incident went viral. Video of the incident, Johnson's words, footage of the crowd, it all went viral on the internet, causing a storm of emotions. People argued, wrote angry comments, and shared their stories. The theme of racism, injustice, and indifference resurfaced, forcing the public to ask again and again, how is this still possible? But somewhere amidst the hype, there was another wave. People started talking about what they could do to make the world a better place. Someone offered to raise money for a woman in a wheelchair. Someone recorded a video message apologizing for their inaction. And someone simply decided that they would never stand on the sidelines again. Dwayne Johnson didn't seek fame. He did what he thought was right. And if that day changed the world one bit, it wasn't his victory. It was the victory of a woman who refused to break, even when the world tried to destroy her. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? We would love to hear your thoughts and stories. You are really important to us, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Subscribe to our channel and give us a like to support us, and don't miss new stories. We wish you a good day and justice in your world.